Hello YouTube and welcome back to my series on the Huns. I finished last time by talking about where the Huns came from and a bit about the nomadic way of life. And now we'll get on to talking about the Huns themselves specifically. So the Huns had moved over into this, to sort of basing themselves into here. And for whatever reason, the Huns became interested in looting and plundering. So they started looting and plundering the settlements of the barbarians around these areas, and then they kept pushing and eventually started looting the East Roman Empire areas as well. They did not have much interest in conquest. They didn't tend to subjugate the people or occupy the cities. They would just plunder them and return to their way of life in their nomadic camps, presumably. So they would snatch and grab pretty much, sometimes even just burning the city to the ground after them. And often, as I mentioned in the intro, they were actually a rather brutal people and would often kill entire towns and so forth. And they decided, don't know why they were like this, and there is a bit more complexity to it, which I'll get into in a minute. Their way of, as I was talking about last time too, they were a rather alien culture to these civilized nations that they came in. They didn't really appear out of nowhere. They were known when they were around this area, but they moved into looting settlements and burning pretty quick, and these nomadic tribes wouldn't be too well known by the general populace. So they sort of come out of nowhere and start striking at the civilized peoples of the area, which added to their aura of terror that they developed. Their way of fighting, while not unknown, was also rather devastating. Civilized nations never really were prepared for nations that didn't fight like them. So the horse archer way of avoiding combat and just shooting your opponent to death in well-coordinated surrounding and various other maneuvers. So they were quite easy. They destroyed these civilized nations quite easily on the battlefield. And it also meant that they moved very quick. Their units were all mounted and could go through day and night on the march a lot easier, just by switching between horses and so forth, and the Huns themselves not actually having to be awake, at least not all of them. So they could move very quickly, hit a town, loot it, and then just retreat off into the no man's lands that they lived in as lived their nomadic way of life in. And that, for the most part, was how the Huns did interact. They weren't really interested in taking a settled way of life. They didn't come in with any desire to settle and be like the Romans or various other nations. They just took what they could and wanted from these civilized peoples and then took it back to their nomadic way of life and lived fairly happily in that. And that's sort of the interesting thing about the Huns, because they did take on a bit of an imperial sort of aspiration towards the end, at least under Attila, and probably a bit earlier. But they went from being more than just nomadic raiders that had control of large amounts of areas and were getting given tribute, as we saw in that intro, large amounts of gold from the settled nations to simply stay away from them. They went from being that to actually wanting control of lands and people. See, that's the big injustice that we do to the Huns and Attila, especially because of our sort of biased understanding of them through only really having the records of these settled people whose lives they sort of came in to destroy, is that most of them sort of think of them as more supernatural beings, demons come to destroy their way of life and take all their stuff, rather than another race of people, another empire former. But by the end, under Attila, it came to resemble a lot like the Rome of the time, or the Persia over here. The old nation of Persia is another good example, because they had subject peoples fighting under them, various allies and levies from lands that they controlled, and even they were engaged quite heavily in the diplomacy of the Roman Empire and so forth. They would do things like raise young Roman heirs at their courts and various things like that the other civilized nations would be doing at this time period as well. Sharing of hostages like that was a good way to keep peace and to also learn about each other's culture and have a stronger bond with them as they grew to adulthood. I can't remember which emperors it was that did that and which generals. Stilicho keeps coming to my mind, but I'm not sure if he was actually the one that was with the Huns or not. But he was a pretty cool general. Barbarian Roman origin, German father, Roman mother, I think, and came to view himself completely as Roman, but wasn't, and was rather mistreated and eventually betrayed by those he served. Kind of a sad story, but seems like a pretty great guy and a good general. But yeah, the Huns were a lot more than just tribal raiders. They were sort of based in Hungary over here, and were even trying subject nations, presumably out this way. And eventually they formed a rather large empire, so stretching out here into Ukraine and Russia and into their all of the steppes essentially, down not quite into Greece, but probably into the Thracian areas up here, controlling all of here and most of Germany, bar the very eastern edge there. They were sort of pushed back on the edge of modern France and so forth over here. More over here. It's hard to tell when your map's clouds. You can see it better down on this little mini map, just for anyone watching for that. And they formed, or they had aspirations at least, well they did form, really, an actual empire akin to Rome. So a lot of this period, and even the later medieval period, is nations trying to be like Rome, and the Huns don't seem to be too much of an exception. But the Huns are interesting and exceptional in the way that they did stick a lot to their nomadic-based culture. So I think they sort of settled a bit, not to the point of having large cities or anything, but semi-permanent. Like Attila's court was probably semi-permanent and so forth. And as I said, the fact that they were sort of based in the sort of smaller Hungarian area and raided out from there into the eastern Rome, western Rome, various places. But they kept to their horseman ways, kept their mounted archery skills and hunting ways sharp and so forth, and kept to, or some at least, kept to the sort of humble way of life as the horse archer. Attila at least did. We have records from guys who were sent to his camp and so forth, and they would talk about how at the feasts thrown in their honor and so forth, they would be fed off silver plates and silver goblets and so forth, whereas Attila would eat off a wooden plate with a wooden cup, and similarly he would dress in a non-ornate fashion without jewelry and so forth. However, his under-chiefs, I guess you'd call them, the sort of lieutenants and so forth, would show off their opulence and extravagance and so forth. So whether this was a peculiarity of Hunnic culture or just the ideals of Attila himself is unknown, but they did definitely stick to their ways and stick to their religion as well. They followed they weren't Christian, and they weren't any of the pagan religions around here either. They were similar to the horse nomad cultures, religions. So the open sky was always very important to nomadic cultures, and that was often sort of in their semi-animistic, semi-polytheistic religion. That is sort of nature worship, but sort of also a pantheon of human deities. They would venerate the sky sort of above all else, and the winds. The earth not so much, was probably less important to them as not being a farming culture, whereas the sky and weather and so forth was. And we see religions like that in the Scythians, the Sarmatians, and later the Mongols and so forth. All had similar-ish religions, venerating the sky and winds and so forth. So the Huns kept to all those ways as they did form their empire, eventually settled after Attila. So Attila was sort of the golden age and the end of the Hunnic Empire. It was under him that it really became an empire. It engaged in all the formal diplomacy a lot more, and it had that empire spanning Germany, Ukraine, Russia, whatever modern nations are down in Thrace and so forth. It had all those areas. That was all under Attila, and he was responsible for a lot of that. And after his death, which was quite young, through some sort of medical complication, possibly he drank too much and caused bleeding and choked on his own blood. That's what the only sort of record we have of it says, but all we know for sure is that he died during a feast over his new wedding of a new bride. The Huns were a polygamous culture, so Attila had many wives. Other men would have had many wives as well, and that was the norm. And it's even said that he looked down on the sort of, I guess you'd call it, attempts at monogamy by a lot of the Roman aristocracy, where they would hold to the ideal of one wife, but often live decadent and immoral lives with various other affairs and so forth going on. So anyway, back on Attila. After his death, at that feast, his empire was divided between his sons, and in a lot of ways he's like Alexander the Great. Conquered huge swathes, formed a large empire, left his mark on the world, died young, and then his successors did nothing but squabble among themselves and eventually lose the empire. So with the Huns it happened a lot quicker. The empire sort of collapsed, they started fighting against each other, their subject nations started to rebel, and eventually they transformed into medieval Hungary, essentially. So eventually they did sort of settle and Christianize and so forth. And getting to the end of what I actually know about the Huns now. So let's actually do something in this game and attack people. Am I at war with anyone yet? guys I don't know. East Rome and Ostrogoths. Oh, there's the Alans. So yeah, we've already pushed them down a bit. Who do I want to attack? Probably everyone. Let's attack everyone. Why not? Okay, who are these guys near? You can reach these guys. Who are these guys? Anti-Huns. These guys are closest. Let's attack these guys. Declare war. Secure the steps. Move in. Oh wow, that's not many troops. But let's fight it anyway, and I'll talk a bit about the units. So in a lot of ways the Huns were like every other horse tribe in the units they used. Lancers, a lot of horse archers. Though it's easy to overlook with these tribes that they weren't all horse archers. Battles were very rarely won or lost by bowmen. They would be won. Most of the battle would be done by guys with spears and swords and your melee attackers. Probably mostly because arrows ran out. And while they could do a lot of damage, and these tribes did rely on them a lot, they were still about a third, made up by about a third of melee, like lancers and so forth. Not so much swordsmen. I think they had some swordsmen, but a spear is obviously a much better weapon to use from horseback. This is an interesting unit. It's got a lot of women in it. I raised the graphics settings, and it doesn't look like my computer can actually run them, so I'll have to lower those. But yeah, these are our mounted tribespeople. As I mentioned in the previous video, women probably fought with them, and in these cultures where everyone travelled around by horseback and knew a lot of the same skills, it's entirely possible that women fought them fairly often, but it's still probably not all that often. War was sort of more the realm of men, probably more because where more expendable women were the childbearers, and that obviously limits technically puts a woman out of action for quite a while. And then breastfeeding being necessary at the time, not an optional thing like now, you would have many years at a time where women couldn't fight and so forth. And also there are people would need to look after the children and so forth during the battles, so women would often stay there and do that. During big migrations where the entire nation is on the move, or very desperate situations where the army sort of faces death or fighting, then women in these cultures would almost certainly have fought, and women without child and so forth probably would have fought more regularly, as evidenced by the various warrior woman graves and so forth I mentioned in the first game. So the step-mounted light rifle here are lancers. So they got a little simple shield with some. I wonder what they use for that script. I wonder if we actually know what the Hunnic script looked like. Whether they used Mongolian or something. Anyway, as you can see, they're very Asian looking. This game's definitely decided to emphasize the Asian aspect of them. As I sort of mentioned, we don't fully know where the Huns are from or their genetics or so forth, but Asian ancestry is very likely. Here we have my chieftain by the look of it. So obviously he's a bit more better equipped than just these average tribesmen here. You've got the lamellar armor that was common to the steppe tribes. I'm not sure if it was always metal, but often it was various little iron scales there, covered with leather and various things. But often it was also it was just hardened leather and so forth, which is actually good protection. It's made into these nice sewn on little scales, and they give a fair amount of flexibility and so forth, not really impeding the rider's movement, and also being lighter so that the horse can be swifter. And the horses here in this room at least are also armoured by that. The spears seem to be the same as all the other spears in this game. I don't know how much detail went into all that. I don't know if they would have had any specific types of spears or anything so forth. Weapons all start to look much more alike in these later periods, Dark Ages, and especially by the Middle Ages, than the very large variety that we have in earlier periods, the Bronze and Iron Ages. But yeah, large head, good for thrusting. Your shield, probably leather. There's not a lot of wood on the steppe, so a lot of things were made out of leather and so forth. Sort of interesting how much metal steppe tribes actually could use. Like the Scythians, for example, were very well-known metal workers, and fancy gold ornamentation and so forth was very common, even among the Huns. Here we have your pretty standard Hunnic troop, so a mounted bowman. Basically it's a guy on a horse with a bow. No armor or anything needed, speed and mobility are his weapons. Those bows are... it's about as advanced a bow as you get in these bows. Though these ones quite seem to be... The Mongols went a little bit further, but basically as far as bows go, this sort of curved composite bow is the strongest you can make it. They would make these out of... it's made of several layers of wood. To give better strength, you'll have ones that are strong in tension on the outer layers, and then ones that compress and spring back out. I don't really know engineering words. Would be the inner layers, so you would make up for having overall poor quality wood, because as I said, steppes are pretty devoid of wood and animal products and so forth. You'd get over poor quality of wood by using the strength of each wood so that they didn't break and gave greater strength, and then gluing them together with glue made from dissolved hide and hooves and so forth. The string would be made of sinew, so muscle and tendon from the spine of an animal and so forth wound together. And these ends, and these bows don't seem to have it, but at least the Mongol bows do, and Hunnic bows probably do too, it's just not shown in game, but they would be covered on the outside there with a layer of horn, which was a very good material for that outer edge of the bow that was also glued on. Possibly even sinew strips added onto it. The Plains Indians did that, I don't know about European horse cultures, but just to add that extra power into the bow, help it to spring out faster and give greater speed for a given poundage. And those caps are just horn, they don't actually need to bend. You bend the wood like that by steaming it, so you put it over boiling water, it soaks into the wood and it actually allows you to bend the wood, which will then set in the way you bend it. So if these bows didn't have that string on it, you'd actually see they would point forward. Those arms would sort of be pointed forwards and away from that, and then they're pulled back into that position by the string, and it gives a lot more power and speed. And as I mentioned before, these men would ride around the enemy, showering them with arrows. Seems to be the bulk of my force here. We have some more lances here. We have a much bigger spear than my general, so I'm guessing my general is a melee cavalry. So yeah, big charging lance. Don't know a great deal about that. These guys seem to just have leather armor. So fairly simple armor to make. More tribesmen. And then you go here. More bowmen. So these guys have armor. Alright, that's probably about all I have time for in this episode, so again it's just a lot of me scrolling around, but well, the point of this channel is I see it's more the history and helping you guys to understand both the history of people and helping stand there to future enjoyment of it. Anyway, until next time.